Thank you. I'm Randy, and today I'm going to present the work that I've been working on with my advisor, Shipra Agrawal, learning in MDPs with convex cost functions, improve regret bounds for inventory management. Everyone hear me all right? All right, great. So first I'd like to talk about just introduce the inventory control problem here. And so then the inventory control problem, at each discrete time step, an inventory manager is tasked with determining the amount of inventory to order to capture and make the most profit off the demand distribution that arrives. So in any given time, at the beginning of the time step, the inventory manager will observe how much inventory they have left over from the previous period. They'll observe new orders that flow in, and then at that time they'll decide how much they should order at this time step. And then over for the rest of the time, a demand will arrive, and it's important to note that you can't actually observe the entire demand. You can only observe the amount of product that you sold. So therefore, all you can observe is the minimum of the inventory you have and the actual demand that arrives. And then finally, at the end, the firm will incur some costs. There'll be the cost of carrying over inventory from this time period to the next. That's holding cost. And then there's the lost sales cost, which is if a customer arrived and you were out of stock, they'll leave without buying your product, and that's sort of like a profit that you missed out on. So this is what happens in one time period, and you just continue. The inventory manager does this for every single time period up to a time horizon, capital T. So there are a couple of important points for this particular problem that we'll be considering. Is first, we're considering a single non-perishable product. So this means that any leftover stock gets carried over to the next time period. Orders have a known fixed lead time. So what this means is that when you place an order in the current time, it will arrive in a fixed time. Like say if lead time is L, then if you place the order at time T, it will arrive in time T plus L. The demand distribution is unknown a priori. So the main goal is to try to learn the demand distribution through having certain amounts of order on stock and observing what happens during that time period. I alluded to this earlier, but the demand is censored. That means you cannot observe demand when you are out of stock. You can only observe sales. So intuitively, this means that we want a higher inventory level in order to fully observe the demand, because if you have a low inventory level and the demand that comes in is higher, you won't know if the demand was just a little bit higher than how much you had or significantly higher. And finally, sales lost to stockouts are permanently lost. So what this means is that a customer will purchase from a competitor, maybe next door, and you will never be able to get that sale back. So they won't come back the next day and buy from you. They'll just buy from someone else. So our goal is to determine the best strategy or the policy to decide new orders based on the leftover order inventory that you have from the previous round, coupled with the known outstanding orders that you have in the pipeline. So we decided to formulate this as a Markov decision process because if you notice that it is a state-dependent problem, the amount of demand that you observe, which is the random variable that we're trying to learn, is completely dependent on how much inventory you have currently, and also the transition will also depend on the orders that you have coming in. So if we formulate this as an MDP, we can say, okay, the state is the current inventory level plus all of the orders in your pipeline that are waiting for fulfillment. The action is the order that the inventory manager decides to take, so how many orders, how many units of the product they decide to order. The state transition is just what happens after the demand comes in, what happens when you update your pipeline of orders, and what happens when the order from L time steps ago comes in. And finally, the cost that you incur is, as I mentioned, the holding and lost sales cost that gets incurred due to the amount of inventory you have on hand and the amount of demand that comes in. Okay, so our optimization goal is simply to determine a policy which minimizes the average or total cost over a time horizon. Equivalently, we can also minimize the regret against the optimal policy. So the regret is just defined as the total expected cost that you incurred, subtracted by the total cost had you been playing the best policy throughout the entire time step. So in the notation here, G pi is the expected long-run average cost of policy pi. I'll refer to this as the asymptotic cost, the long-run cost, expected long-run cost. So the optimal policy would just be the overall possible pi, the minimum G pi. And here's just the expression for G pi. It's the limit, the average expected limit, if you take the limit as t to infinity, of the average cost. Okay, any questions so far? Great.
Do you have the production cost in there, or you had the holding cost?
No, we're just going to consider the holding cost and the lost sales cost, but it depends if you can assume that the production cost is kind of constant and kind of just in terms of just, it'll be fixed. But so inventory control over arbitrary policies is difficult in general, even with a known demand distribution. So therefore, we're going to relax our goal a little bit, and we're just going to try to minimize regret against the best policy in a benchmark class of policies. So it's exactly the same regret definition, except when you're considering the optimal policy, you only consider a certain set of policies, capital pi. And in our case, we decided to look at what's called a base stock policy. So if pi x is a base stock policy, all that says is to order the minimum amount required to bring your inventory position to level X. And by inventory position, I mean the sum of your current inventory on hand and all of your orders that are in the pipeline that are going to come in. So given leftover inventory IT from the previous round and outstanding orders O, if you follow the base stock policy at time t, you will order the positive part of X minus the sum of all the orders and the inventory you have on hand currently. So why use base stock policies? So first off, simply, base stock policy level is very intuitive. It's low cost, it's low effort, it's easy to implement. And also, it was shown that it has what's called asymptotic optimality, which means that as your lost sales cost becomes much greater than holding cost, you actually can converge to the optimal cost over all policies. But more importantly, so base stock levels actually have a convexity property, and that's the main convexity property that we're going to leverage in this talk, in our algorithm. And it's that if you assume that you have a demand distribution where the chance of no demand happening is positive, then the asymptotic cost g of x is actually convex in x, where x is the base stock level. Okay, so just want to talk a little bit about challenges in terms of designing an algorithm to tell the agent what to play, what policies to order. So first off, as I mentioned, there's sensor demand. So sales observed depends on the current inventory state, and the demand and lost sales are not necessarily observed. So we handle this by having this state-dependent system, like in our Markov decision process model. And another challenge is that there's the lead time. So an ordering decision is not fulfilled immediately. This increases the state space size exponentially, since we need to keep track of past orders. And what I mean by this is, in related work, there's been a lot of work in regret minimization for finite horizon MDPs, and they've all achieved a ds root AT regret bound, where S is the size of the state space, and A is the size of the action space, and T is the time horizon. And so in our case, if we try to apply this directly to our problem, what we notice is that the inventory problem, the state and the action space is continuous, or at least very large. And so if we discretize and we try applying this bound, what we'll get is a state space that's raised to the power of L, because we have the inventory level plus L incoming orders. So our state space size is actually exponential. So therefore, we can't just directly apply this type of result. And so related work in this specific problem has been studied. So 10 years ago, they presented a t to the 2/3 regret bound with an exponential dependence on L. And they also proved that a t to the 1/2 regret bound, a square root t regret bound, was the optimal. And this was actually shown 2 years ago in this paper. They showed a regret bound of square root t. So in this regret bound, C is the product of some positive probabilities about the demand distribution, and U is the pre-specified maximum allowable base stock level. So what we notice again is that the regret bound is still exponential. There's a term that's exponential in L. So our goal was to say, okay, let's try to see if we can improve this dependence. And so our main result is that given a demand distribution F, where there's a non-zero chance of no demand happening, this is purely so that we can use that convexity result I presented earlier. If we have convexity, then we can give an online learning algorithm for the inventory control problem with regret bounded as follows. And we match the optimal dependence on t with a square root t regret bound. And more importantly, our regret is linear in the lead time L. And here, so D you can think of as sort of like the diameter of the MDP I presented in the D root SAT bound I presented earlier, if you're familiar with that. But otherwise, you can think of D as the expected number of time steps to decrease your inventory level. So why you need this is any learning algorithm is always going to try to reach different inventory levels and see how good that inventory level is. And if you overshoot the best inventory level, you're going to have to wait for that inventory level to decrease before you can try a lower inventory level. So D is kind of like a parameter that controls how long it takes once you overshoot to reach a lower state. And it's important to note that we actually achieve an additive dependence on D. It's not multiplicative. Okay. And also the algorithm does not need to know the value of D. So how we started thinking about this problem is trying to model it like a multi-arm bandit model. So in the classical multi-arm bandit model, you have k arms, each arm giving a reward in 0, 1. And a bandit has an inherent censoring. You can only see what you pull, which is great. So we thought, okay, what if the inventory level is an arm? Demand censoring will be taken care of naturally. However, you cannot pull an inventory level arm. It's more of a state and not an action. So went back to the drawing board and we looked at a second model, which is what if the base stock level is an arm? And what if pulling arm X gives the long run cost of the base stock policy? You would have to deal with the fact that the space of arms is continuous, but since G of X is convex in X, you can use standard convex bandit algorithms that solve this type of problem. So we want to try to work with model 2, but recall that in the bandit model, pulling the arm gives the long run cost, whereas in our case, if we play one action, we only observe one instance of the cost, and this does not give an unbiased estimate of the long run cost. So we need to try to estimate the long run cost from instantaneous cost samples. And also it's important to note that we can't change the base stock level or our action too much. If we change it too much, then we can't actually estimate the long run cost. So fortunately for us, there's this paper, this is a stochastic convex bandit algorithm, in which the decision is not frequently changed, which allows us to accumulate instantaneous samples at a fixed base stock level to estimate the long run cost. And so one of our main results was proving a concentration lemma that says that if you collect n samples of the instantaneous cost, it is bounded with high probability close to the long run expected cost at that base stock level. And H here is the bias of the MDP. And so what do I mean by bias? So the initial samples of cost are going to be biased from your long run cost due to the starting state. So depending on where you start, sometimes you're going to be a little bit more off than if you start somewhere else. And actually, this notion of bias is very well defined in MDPs. The definition is here, but if you're familiar with the Bellman equations, V of X is the bias. And so in the Bellman equation, you have the bias showing up, the bias term showing up, as well as your long run cost. And so the second main result of our paper is to show that the bound on the bias for the inventory problem is bounded by, H is bounded by max of holding cost, lost sales penalty, and lead time and U. And again, the linear dependence in U here is what allows us to improve upon the exponential dependence on lead time in the previous works. And so we actually show an almost black box connection to stochastic convex bandits for this inventory problem. The entire complexity is in bounding the bias of the MDP and the corresponding concentration result. So for any problem actually with a large continuous state space and action space, if you know that you have a convex objective and you can show a bias bound and the corresponding concentration result, you can actually just apply this directly and get a better regret bound or an optimal regret bound in time, and in many cases improve on the other factors. Okay, and that's it. Any questions?